We have been speaking recently with Dr. Virginia Sanchez Korrol about her newest book, The Season of Rebels and Roses, a historical novel for teens which follows women's involvement in the 19th century independence movements to free Puerto Rico and Cuba from Spain. Well, then I was invited to a forum at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Hunter College, CUNY, and it deals with writing historical fiction to reach and teach new audiences. And there was Dr. Virginia Sanchez Korrol speaking about her
Professor,
book. Let's listen.
Dr. Sanchez Korrol, what is that message you want to get across?
You know what I would like students to know, and I think I would like everyone to know, is what my book is about. And the way that I see it, it's about a young, spoiled, a young woman who is terribly spoiled and self-centered,
That sounds familiar.
who then goes through 10 years of maturation. When she comes to New York, she doesn't know what to expect. She has tragedy in her life. She has ambition. She has passion. She begins to meet people that are out of her class for the first time. She comes from a working class, not really working class. She actually comes from a family where her father is a clerk for the Spanish government, and they live middle class, I would say. But when she comes to New York, she's part of the working class. And I think that had to be very, very hard for her in real life. And I wanted to convey that in the book, that this woman is put to the test. She sacrifices, she has courage, she continues. And finally, when we meet her, at the end of the story, she is a woman who is confident, sure of herself, and knows exactly what road she wants to take. And that's an important lesson, I think, for the young adult readers that I'm really directing this book to.
Thank you.
We're very proud to have this panel. Before I introduce the moderator, Vanessa Perez Rosario, who's going to lead us in this panel, I just want to say a couple of words about the program that we have. We just completed a conference in Puerto Rico about empresarismo social y reconstrucción, which is the topic of the day down there. Puerto Rico was very successful. That's the 14th conference that we do around the recovery, the Rebuild Puerto Rico, in general, the economic crisis, and now with the post-Maria hurricane. We have a few new reports that I encourage you to look for them on the web. I'm not sure if we have copies of them here tonight, but we just put a report on housing last June, the housing crisis in Puerto Rico. We just put another report on federal policy for Puerto Rico that came out last week in conjunction with the conference. The theme was federal policy impact on Puerto Rico moving forward in the reconstruction. And we also put a 1 year after report on Maria, on post-Maria Puerto Rico. And all those are available for you on our website. So I encourage you to go there. We also have, I believe we have copies of our program for the remainder of the semester. So I welcome you. I hope that you have an opportunity to visit our library and archives. Now, it is my pleasure, as I said, to introduce Vanessa Perez Rosario, who is an associate professor of modern languages and literatures at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Her research and teaching interests include Latinx literature, transnational feminism, bilingualism, and translation. She is the author of Becoming Julia de Burgos, The Making of a Puerto Rican Icon, and you can see a whole panel around that topic in our website. We record all this and then we put it in the repository. She's also the editor of Hispanic Caribbean Literature of Migration, Narrative of Displacements, and I believe we have another panel. So you can see we're a big fan of her work. Her translation of Mayra Santos Febre's collection of poetry, Boat People, is forthcoming in 2019. She is at work on a new book project Other Humanities, Latinx Literature, and Human Rights. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all and welcome Vanessa to lead this panel. Thank you.
The season of Rebels and Roses is a season, the season when Puerto Rican men and women were living in New York City and other parts of the United States and fighting for the liberation of Puerto Rico from U.S. bases. The season is also a time in the life of Inocencia Martinez Figueroa, where she goes from a very spoiled, self-centered young woman, and 10 years later, she becomes the confident feminist and activist that we know. The book is based on history, and what I have done with the story is that I have tried to make it accessible to young adults. That would be mostly high school and college students, in order to take the history that we prize so much and make it into a story that will bring them to the table and will ask the questions, well, what happened? A colleague of mine, a historian, who read the book and wrote to me and said, the story, I love the story's fine, I love the pace, is a good pace, but you don't tell enough. What happened? What happened to her? What happened to her husband? What is she doing? What is she doing? And when did they leave New York? And I called her up and I said, those questions are exactly the questions that I want to hear. Because if you were my student right now, and you were asking me those questions, I would take you by the hand and I would guide you to the library and I would show you where those history books are, where you're going to get the story of what happened next. I want to tell you a little bit about Inocencia, so I'll start by introducing her, and I'm going to limit the number of readings that I'm going to do. When she attended her first public lecture. The topic was 1868 Lares Revolt for Independence from Spain. And one fiery speaker in particular caught her complete attention. His words boomed with a passion for justice that inspired the impressionable girl. Her pulse began to race so fast she found it difficult to remain still, not to jump up to her feet and voice her approval. The charismatic speaker was the mulatto journalist Sotero Figueroa. His rousing calls for freedom from colonial repression, for an independent Puerto Rico, enthralled the audience. Inocencia's mind soared, taking intellectual leaps she'd never known before. She was excited to join in the movement, to bring about the liberation he spoke of. All of those things she wanted with an urgency, in ways that she hadn't expected. For a second she thought of her family. Like others in Ponce's white society, they believed that even a hint of African blood polluted family trees. But I'll get around that. That's when she realized she'd crossed a forbidden social boundary. I'm destined for an exciting, challenging future, she promised herself, jutting her square chin forward in mock defiance. Shortly thereafter, Inocencia joined Doña Lola's women's group. An educated mother knows enough to educate her children, Lola would say, going against the grain of popular belief that women would use book learning to write love letters, some written by Doña Lola herself, and devise strategies for social change. They signed petitions and joined protests. That's how Inocencia began to believe in women's rights and freeing her people and crossing society's color line. So now you know who Inocencia is, and the season will follow her growth and maturity as a young woman, as a married woman, as a mother, as a revolutionary, as an activist. Her life is full of tragedy, it's full of joy, and in the final analysis, the greatest tragedy of all happens in 1898, when the United States takes Puerto Rico as a colony, and all her work is for nothing. I had a hard time doing that part because we know about the men, We know what they did. We know about Betances, we know about Sotero Figueroa, we know about the men. We know everything that they did. There are written records, there are letters, there are minutes kept of all of their doings. We know when they create the Puerto Rico section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. We know when they decide to invade Puerto Rico. We have all of that in our archives. What we do not have is how did the women feel? And so I want to let you have an idea of my interpretation of how she must have felt at that point in time. Central Park. And she has her little boy with her. She's holding on to his hand because he's a rambunctious 5-year-old and she can't let him escape to go into the sheep meadows and play with the animals. She's a very protected mother. And she has to answer Lola's question. And she answers by saying, the truth? You want to know how I feel? Inocencia's face fell into the deepest anguish. She stopped in her tracks to compose herself. And then she faced Doña Lola. Empty. I feel empty. I have a huge hollow space right here. Letting go of her son's arm, she made a circle with her hand around her midsection. And angry. And sad. Lola, I'm so sad. I could cry and never stop. How could anyone feel anything else? And a couple of pages later, Lola responds with her own feelings. Lola couldn't bring herself to respond. With one hand on her makeshift cane, she kept her eyes fixed on the path before her, lost in her own thoughts. She thought about her 30 years of struggle, the countless letters she'd written every day, the fundraisers, the piano concerts, the poetry readings, the meetings. She remembered the feeling of exile. Her entire life was the movement. How do you suddenly let go of something that's dominated every waking hour of your entire life? So now you have a sense of what the women are like. I want to go through some of the pictures of who they really were, what they really looked like. That is Inocencia Figueroa. Her full name was Inocencia Martinez Santaella, and she married Sotero Figueroa, so her name is Figueroa. And she, and that's probably the only picture that we have of her. And fewer we have. This woman is one of her mentors in New York City. The first thing that she does is that she meets with Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, who was an activist and organized the first women's group in the 10 Years' War. You have to understand that the War of 1895 begins with Lares and Yara in 1868. It takes 30 years of that war before we finally come to the conclusion. Emilia Casanova de Villaverde's portrait actually is found in the Museum of Cárdenas in Cuba, which was her hometown. And this is Lola Rodriguez de Tio at the time of this of the story. Lola is an older woman. She has been through the Lares struggle. She has written La Borinqueña. We're well known for writing the radical words, revolutionary words to the song. And Lola takes on Inocencia as if she were her own daughter. You have to understand the context into which these people came. It was very, very different from Puerto Rico. First, they're coming because of the revolution. They're coming to work with, Sotero's going to work with Patria. He's going to be the editor of Patria. He's going to work side by side with Martí in a relationship that is as close as any relationship you can imagine. And this is a world of newspapers. New York City is a world of newspapers where newspapers vie with one another to get the attention of the buyers. And on any given day during the time of Inocencia and Lola's residing in New York, you would find the street corners filled with the newsies selling newspapers and yelling out what the news of the day was. A very, very high energy, very competitive, very, very exciting way of life. Nothing compared to what they left behind in Puerto Rico. And this gives you an idea of the world that they had entered in order to acclimate themselves to a world of darkness and gloom, where the sun sometimes shines, nothing like what they left in Puerto Rico. And so the rupture, the exile was doubly important to them because it was a whole new world. And they spoke in English. So Inocencia has to figure out how she's going to deal with that. The Bellevue Hospital ambulance, to give you an example of what health was like during those days. But this is the hospital that Dr. Henna was attached to. And Dr. Henna was, of course, the head of the Puerto Rico section of the Cuban Revolutionary. This is a wealthy area of Manhattan. That's Fifth Avenue right there. And across from it is what Bonocio Dio in my book calls the Big Pyramid. It was the Croton Reservoir right across, where today the public library is on Fifth Avenue between 42nd Street and 40th Street. One of the things that I found fascinating is when you begin to do the research, and this is part of the research to teach new audiences, when you begin to do the research and you start to read something, you have no idea where it's going to lead you. I was doing a lot of reading on the type of houses that people were living in during this time, because there are very wealthy people among the Puerto Ricans that I'm talking about, and they lived in very, very fancy houses. And then there was Sotero Figueroa and Inocencia, who lived in a row house between 2nd and 3rd Avenue with the elevated railroads on each of those avenues, spewing smoke and dirt and all kinds of noise. When I came across this picture and I was reading about the houses, I suddenly came upon the story of another doctor from Bellevue, and I found out that the block that Dr. Henna lived on was a block where a lot of the doctors from Bellevue Hospital lived. You would be on 40th Street, close to 5th Avenue, and that's where number 8, 40th Street was. And this became very, very significant for me because I was able to really talk about the different class system and how they all work together in common cause. So one of the things I found out when I read Eleanor's book was that her book begins at the beginning of the 20th century in Puerto Rico, and my book ends in 1899, right after the Spanish-American War, when Puerto Rico becomes a colony of the United States. And in comparing the two books, I was just fascinated by the particular themes that she picked up on that were similar to mine.
Historian and writer, her first book, From Colonia to Community, The History of Puerto Ricans in New York City, 1918 to 1948, broke new ground in the study of Boricua diasporic communities. Her latest book, for teens, The Season of Rebels and Roses, which we're going to hear from today, returns to the 19th century roots of that community through the genre of the historical novel. Among her many publications are the acclaimed 3-volume encyclopedia, Latinas in the United States, a historical encyclopedia, and Latina Legacies, Identity, Biography, and Community, both co-edited with Dr. Vicky Ruiz. Recent books include Feminist and Abolitionist, the story of Emilia Casanova, and her first children's book, A Surprise for Teresita, Una Sorpresa para Teresita. This season of Rebels and Roses, it gives us Virginia gives us a sense of the role of women, how active women were in the revolutionary movement and what their roles were. And of course, I'm really wondering about this scrapbook. Is this scrapbook? around, or is this yes, you just imagined her saving all of these things that didn't make it into an archive?
The reason the scrapbook came up is first because it's historical in the story, but also because when the women did not attend, the women were not part of the men's organizations. There were a few organizations that were male, female, but when Henna closes the books on the Puerto Rico section, he saves everything. He puts it in a lockbox because it's going to be part of the history. He saves everything, and it's available, it's online, it's available, his letters, the minutes of the meetings. Every meeting had las actas. Inocencia's Women's Club, which is the first one, and lasted for, it begins in 1892 up until 1898, there are 3 minutes that appear in the archives when you do research on them, and the importance of that for us is monumental. And had we the women's with Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, we have a number of the minutes of her clubs. She creates the first club for the 10 Years' War. So that's where the scrapbook comes from, because you have to have a scrapbook, otherwise you have to write, you have to leave something, you have to, whether it's oral history, whether it's telling, or whether it's writing. You've got to leave something, otherwise your existence is erased. When we put together the Encyclopedia, we have a 3-volume Encyclopedia of Latinas in the United States that was very well received. And so we have about, 500 women, 500 stories in it. We have them in the Centro library if you're interested, or in local libraries. It's all over. There was one woman that I couldn't get her. I think I got 500 entries, and this one woman kept appearing to me. I dream about her. I think about her. I had never come across her before. I didn't write her entry either. Somebody else had written it, and I started to think about her life because it would be the beginning of the 3. I imagine a trilogy, if I live that long, a trilogy to put these 3 books together, and I decided that I was going to write her story. I had 200 letters that she had written, and I did all the research, and I had all of the information. It wouldn't come. I couldn't write it as a history. There was something missing. What was missing was the fact that we tend to write women into history in the barest way. Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, la amante de la bandera. Please. You know, the same thing with Inocencia, the first woman to create But I knew that they had a life, and I knew that they had a life in New York, in the places that I knew about, and so I ended up writing that novel on her, with the idea that I would introduce Inocencia and then carry the Puerto Rican book, would then be written. It wasn't like my brother tells me, your books are never going to be bestsellers. Okay, that's fine, as long as my brother, everybody reads them. So I said, really? Well, I want you to know, this book is doing really well. And what happened as a result of that book, and the story, is that after the book was out about 4 years, her descendants got in touch with me. Now I'm saying, wait a minute, I'm writing a book about a 19th century woman. She's not supposed to have descendants. What am I doing wrong? Am I going to get sued over something that I said about her? Well, the descendants got 2 of them who didn't know each other. And because of the book, the entire family has now come together. They traced their family history back to the 1100s in Spain. They are the ones that facilitated for me the pictures of the Casanova family, which I would have never gotten. They found the 3rd member of the family. There were 3 brothers originally. Each of these women is a daughter of one of the brothers. And the entire family has reunited based on the book. You never know why things happen. With Inocencia, it's different because with Inocencia, there just isn't enough historical information. And so you've got to, although her biographer wrote, Inocencia Martínez Santa ella, de inocencia no tenía nada, y de santa menos. Her biographer is Josefina Toledo, a Cuban historian who lives in Havana.
Oh, I know she is.
You know, 5 million of us in the United States. There is no place for our story. If you look at the social studies curriculum, which I worked on for years with the state, to try to get in one little bit of information, it was a struggle. So by the time they get into college and they want to find out, or they come through the ambassador, the cultural ambassadors program, and they find out their history, that's too late. And you need to reach them when they're interested. And right now they're reading all kinds of great books about growing up in Brooklyn and shadow shapers and all of this exciting, fast-moving stuff. But you also have to make room for the historical stuff, because that's where they see themselves. And once they see themselves in the curriculum, and they know that there's a sense of ownership in terms of locale, in terms of region, in terms of themselves. So yeah, encourage them to use the books. And
thank you so much for agreeing to